I am continuing on my journey to try to work my way through the literary canon of the ancient world, and I now come to Atra-Hasis, the Babylonian story of the flood. So, as you are probably aware, there are many different versions of the flood story in the ancient world. The most famous of which, of course, is the story of Noah's Ark from the Bible. But not only in the Bible, but also in ancient Mesopotamia, there were different versions of this flood story. And in fact, in the book I just previously reviewed, Babylon, Mesopotamia, and the Birth of Civilizations, the author talks about how important this flood story was, and how in the ancient world this in their legends reflected a break between the very ancient world and then the modern world of history. So there was the before the flood days and the after the flood days. Before the flood days was referred to as the antediluvian. So there's a new vocabulary word for you that you can try and work in with your friends the next time you see them. Antediluvian, before the flood. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. Anyways, last year I read and reviewed on this channel the Epic of Gilgamesh, which contained in it a flood story. And I somewhat naively thought that that was the origin of the Mesopotamian flood story. But the more you read, the more you know. Turns out there is actually older versions of this flood story which predate the Epic of Gilgamesh. And there's Atra-Hasis, which is believed to be the basis of the flood story which the Epic of Gilgamesh uses. Now, I was a little bit confused initially, and this is, I guess, just due to my bad memory. When I was reading through this, and they have Atra-Hasis, which is an Akkadian epic, and this is supposed to be the basis for the flood story in the Epic of Gilgamesh. And I was thinking to myself, but I thought I remembered something about the Epic of Gilgamesh being older. The Epic of Gilgamesh actually going back to the Sumerian language, which predated the Akkadian language. But then, unfortunately, I couldn't go back to my copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh because that was a library book that I returned to the library after I finished reading it last year. And besides which, I was living in a different country at that time. So I have no Epic of Gilgamesh before me now, but I did go to Wikipedia. And Wikipedia actually reminded me of what was actually the order. So the Epic of Gilgamesh is based on 5 old Sumerian poems. But those 5 old Sumerian poems were not the Epic of Gilgamesh that we know today. That Epic of Gilgamesh that we know today was later developed in the Akkadian language. And so this here, the Atra-Hasis, is also written in the Akkadian language. So, to summarize, Epic of Gilgamesh is originally based on the ancient Sumerian poems, but was later developed into an Akkadian epic. And only part of the Epic of Gilgamesh is about the flood. That's Tablet 11. And I think it's Tablet 11, right? Was it Tablet 11 or Tablet 9? Ugh. Apologies for my faulty memory. Only part of the Epic of Gilgamesh was the flood story. And that part apparently had its basis in the Atra-Hasis poem. So the authors of this book, or I guess maybe the translators and editors, tried to collect here all the ancient Mesopotamian stories about the flood. So they have the Atra-Hasis, which is the main one. They also have the flood story from Ras Shamma, which is something that was discovered outside of Mesopotamia. I want to say it was the Hittite Empire, if I remember correctly. What today I believe is modern Syria. And this is the only version of the Babylonian flood story which is found outside of ancient Mesopotamia. But it's only a couple paragraphs long. And then we have Berosus, I'll come back to him later. And then we have the Sumerian flood story, which is much less developed than Atra-Hasis, but possibly this is the origin of it. They talk briefly in the introduction as well about the Greek and Roman version, which they say, unfortunately, it is only known from late sources. So we don't have any early sources on the Greek and Roman mythology version of the flood. But incidentally, they say that the fullest form is that in Ovid's Metamorphoses from the early in the first century. Sorry, Metamorphoses, early in the first century. And if you've been watching this channel, you'll know that I reviewed Ovid Metamorphoses just the other week. And one of the things that I didn't talk about when I reviewed this book was Ovid's version of the flood story. Because, you know, there are a lot of versions of this flood story, as I've been saying. But Ovid seems to me to be the only person who is allowing his imagination to play with the flood story. So instead of just saying there was a flood and the waters covered the earth, Ovid says, and, you know, the fishes were swimming around in what used to be people's houses, and the dolphins were going through the forests, and he tries to imagine what it would be like if the aquatic life was suddenly all over what used to be human and plant habitats. The cities and the forest just covered with the ocean life. So that's another interesting point about Ovid's Metamorphosis that I completely forgot to mention when I was talking about it last week. But we are not talking about Ovid's Metamorphosis today. We are talking about this story here. They mention in the introduction that their goal here is to collect all the Mesopotamian versions of the flood story in one volume, except for the one in the Epic of Gilgamesh. They leave that one out. And if memory serves, the reason that they left it out was because it was documented elsewhere. But it would have been nice to include it in this volume as well. And, I think the Epic of Gilgamesh is in the public domain, so they could easily have included it here. And, like I said, even though the Epic of Gilgamesh is available elsewhere, and even though I myself have read it elsewhere, I don't remember it perfectly. So while we're reading through these versions of the flood story, why not just include the Epic of Gilgamesh version of the flood story as well, just so the reader can compare and contrast without having to hunt down a different volume. You could have it all in one volume. So that's what I would have liked, but that's not what they did. So I'm having to rely somewhat off of my memory for the flood story as it was told in the Epic of Gilgamesh and also Wikipedia, which I just consulted right before filming this video. But anyways, the Atra-Hasis story. So this is an interesting story here, and there are parts missing. But here's what they've been able to reconstruct. So we start off with Tablet 1. So when the gods, like men, bore the work and suffered the toil. So there are the lesser gods, I guess they're called the Igigi, who are made to do the work. They have to dig the canals and the rivers and the irrigations because there are no humans around to do the work. And they revolt. They go into open revolt. They burn their tools, set fire to their tools, and tell the rest of the gods that we are not going to do your work anymore. So the gods come up with a plan to get someone to do the work, and they create humans. And in order to create the humans, they have to slaughter one of their own gods, one of their number, and use his blood together with the soil, the clay, and also saliva, one of the gods spits in them, to create humans. Now, this is obviously mirroring the creation story in the Enuma Elish, another Babylonian story. Now, in the Enuma Elish, they also created the humans by killing one of the gods. That was Quingu, who had been he had been Tiamat's consort, who Marduk had defeated. So, his punishment for fighting Marduk was he was slaughtered, and they used his blood to create humans. Here they just choose a random god. There are some notes, I think, at the back that could be in one of the missing sections, that one of the gods they slaughtered could have been one of the ringleaders of this rebellion. But if that's so, that's in one of the missing sections. As far as we know, it's just a random god they slaughtered. And created humans out of them, and then humans were doing the work. But the humans the humans became very noisy as they multiplied. And Enlil, who is the god of the earth, had trouble sleeping because the humans were so noisy. So there are, I guess, three main gods here. There's Anu, who's the sky god, Enlil, who's the god of the earth, and Enki, who's the god of the underworld. And Enlil, because he's, I guess, on the same plane as the humans, has to put up with their noise. And he wants to wipe them out because they're so noisy. Which, again, as far as memory serves, that's the same reason given for the flood in the Epic of Gilgamesh. But there's a king of the humans, and his name is Atra-Hasis, which is where we get the name of this epic from. And he prays to Enki to save them. So at first, Enlil sets a famine on the humans. At first I think it was the plague. He sets a plague on the humans. But Enki gives Atra-Hasis advice to sacrifice to the god of the plague. On Enki's advice, they left a sacrifice to the god of the plague, and then the plague god left them. So then Enlil's next move is to have a famine. So the rain is not going to rain, is going to withhold the rain. And again, Atra-Hasis asks Enki for advice, and Enki, being sympathetic to the humans, advises the same plan. Atra-Hasis is supposed to sacrifice to the rain god, Nisaba, I believe. And they do this, and then the rain god discreetly rains for them, and their crops return. And Enlil realizes something's up, so he calls all the gods together and he says, okay, we're all agreed on this plan to wipe out the humans, right? Nobody let the rain god through and let the rain god rain for them. Now, what happens next is fragmented and a little bit hard to tell. But in the introduction for this volume, the translators and editors give the suggestion that apparently there's some subterranean body of water, possibly with a lot of sea monsters in it, that's underground, in which Enki goes down, and possibly he has to fight some of the water monsters. It's a little bit unclear, but then releases a bunch of fish to feed the humans. So then Enlil really has got his mind set up on, wiping out the humans. So he gets all the gods together to swear that they're not going to help the humans and that they're going to wipe them out with a flood. But Enki is able to send a message down to Atra-Hasis. And again, I think this lines up with the Epic of Gilgamesh, as far as I can remember. There was one human who was favored by Enki, and Enki was able to sneak out and send him a message, even in spite of Enlil's determination to wipe out the humans. Then we have the flood. And Atra-Hasis and his family are saved in the boat, along with some of the animals, similar to Noah's Ark. What's different than Noah's Ark, though, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the human, who's got a slightly different name, his name was, I forget his name, Ninpetimishu or something like that. Apologies, he's got a slightly different name, but according to Wikipedia, it's just a different version of the same guy. Apparently there were different versions of his name, I guess different dialects. Anyways, the guy in the Epic of Gilgamesh, he released 3 birds to see if the water was receding. Similar to the story in Noah's Ark, where Noah also released 3 birds. So that's a direct parallel between the Epic of Gilgamesh and the flood story in Genesis. But we don't get the birds in this version. So however the birds enter the story, they're not in this version yet. But yeah, the flood does recede. The gods are determined not to wipe out humans again. And in fact, while the flood is going on, the gods immediately regret what they have done. So they'd been talked into it by Enlil. But once they see what's going on and they realize that the humans that they had created to do their work are being wiped out, they said, oh, what have we done? Why did we let ourselves get talked into this? We need those humans to do our work. We're the ones who created them after all. They do come up with some plan to keep the human population in control. There's something about a demon who's going to snatch babies, stop childbirth. So the number of humans are going to be reduced, but they're not going to wipe out all the humans again. So that's the story. Now, because this is, I guess, a scholarly book intended for a scholarly audience, they have an Assyrian recension, which is a different version of the story, which fills in some of the gaps here. Yes, as with a number of the books I've been reading on Assyrian or Babylonian literature, this one is aimed at scholars. So it's got a transliteration here of the cuneiforms, which I completely ignored because I can't read it. I just focused on the English. And then after that, we get to what I talked about before, the flood story from Rosh Shamar, which is the only version of the Babylonian flood story found outside Mesopotamia so far. But you can see, I mean, this is it. There's not much story to immerse yourself in. And then we have Berosus here, who is somebody who's been popping up in my reading occasionally as I've been reading these books about ancient Babylon or ancient Mesopotamia. He was a Babylonian who apparently lived during the Greek age, the Hellenistic age, who wrote a history of Babylon and included the Babylonian myths in it. Unfortunately, his work has not survived. And in this page here, they chronicle how we know about him. So his work has not survived, but there's somebody else who quoted from him extensively. Alexander Polyhistor. But his work has not survived either. But we have a church father who quoted from him, and his work has not survived either, at least not in the original Greek. But we have a translation of his work, which has appeared somewhere in, where was it? Yeah, the translation of his work appeared somewhere else. So as this introduction notes, it's a little bit of a sketchy textual history to try and establish how accurate our version of Berosus is, or even how accurate Berosus's myths are. But what's interesting about Berosus, and we've got 3 different versions here of him. One, Berosus according to Polyhistor, and then Berosus according to Abydinus. Oh, sorry, maybe that's only 2. But in these 2 different versions, what's interesting is this one includes the birds, the 3 birds that get sent out, similar to the version in Noah's Ark and also the version in the Epic of Gilgamesh. And then the last one is the Sumerian flood story. And there's an introduction here which notes that the theme of a flood which destroys mankind does not seem to belong to the main body of Sumerian traditions. So we do have the Sumerian flood story, but allusions to it are lacking in the texts, which are presumed to go back to older originals. So we've got a version of it, but it's not ingrained in their tradition. It doesn't show up in the other texts. I at least my understanding of what they're trying to say here. Take everything I say with a grain of salt, because I'm not a scholar. I'm just going through this based on my paltry understanding and my faulty memory of what I've read, if that's not already obvious. So yeah, this is relatively short here and not much of a narrative, but there it is. And then the rest of this is just notes. I did try, just for the record, to make my way through these notes as well, just to be thorough. Most of these notes have to do with the original grammar of the language, which was well over my head, but occasionally there was something in here about the meaning as well. So, yeah. A lot of this book was over my head because it was targeted at scholars, but I did feel like I was able to understand at least part of it. Read the introduction, felt like I got something out of it. Read through the original myth here. I mean, well, not the original language, but read through the English translation. Felt like I understood it more or less. So I'm going to count this off as another classic under my belt. And if you're not a scholar, I don't know if I would recommend spending money on this book because it's aimed at scholars. But if you can order it from your local library, like I did, I got this from Interlibrary Loan, then, you know, skip over all the stuff that you can't understand. But there should be enough interesting stuff in here that you can understand, that is accessible to the ordinary person, that it might be worth tracking down if you're interested in mythology or ancient Mesopotamia or any of that. If it sounds remotely interesting to you, check your library and see if they have this.